Welcome to Cuke Audio Podcast, a presentation of Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his. And anything else that comes to mind. My name is David Chadwick, and I'm the Poobah of Cuke Archives. I'm speaking to you from Sanur with Doggett Bandita and Feline Cuchita at my side. Dear Katrinka is in America, and no plane's gonna land here with her for a while. So I appreciate your being here to keep me company in my self-isolation. Before we go any further, I must thank our sponsor. This program is brought to you through the generous support of you, our dear listeners. We are most grateful. Thank you. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to Cuke Audio's podcast number 5. Immediately following this brief table of contents, at the 3-minute 41-second mark, we'll have Life in Bali, joined by Sarah Wormald, diving guru, which will be followed at 15 minutes and 36 seconds by a talk with Peter Schneider, old Shunryu Suzuki student who lived in Japan many years and now with his wife Jane are the teachers of the Beginner's Mind Zen Center in Northridge, California, part of Los Angeles. At 37 minutes and 3 seconds, there will be Chapter 2 of Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki. At 1 hour, 43 minutes, and 44 seconds, it will conclude, and then we will have the dramatic closing, which will vanish into nothingness at 1 hour, 46 minutes, and 42 seconds. Enjoy. I pray that you and your loved ones are safe and comfortable and healthy. I imagine you're tucked away somewhere, fairly isolated from others. This can't go on forever. It could for me. I'm fully engaged. I miss Katrinka, but other than that, I like this life, but it can't go on forever for everybody. Today, I heard an interview with Dr. David Katz, and I really liked what he had to say. So I'm not going to paraphrase it or anything, but I'd suggest check him out. He seems to me to be the middle way in dealing with the virus, and he's totally science-based and reputable. So looking at Bali, right now, the figures today are, it says there's 186 positives and 4 deaths. These numbers are growing very slowly here, which is good. However, of course, we have doubts about the methods of counting, the lack of testing and that sort of thing. I wanted to bring in my friend Sarah here to talk about it, so I'm going to make a call to her now.
Hello?
Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
Hey, nice picture, nice Skype picture here, very nice.
Thank you very much.
So, Sarah, we were walking to the beach the other day with Bondi, keeping a good distance apart and wearing our wearing masks as we are required to do. We were talking about the number of virus cases there are here, how slowly it's climbing, and how few deaths. And you mentioned something about the way they keep records, death records. Would you refresh my mind on that?
Yeah, it's more the way they don't keep death references and records. So, yeah, especially on Nusa Lembongan, there's no official record of deaths at all. It's merely a case of have a cremation or a burial and then a cremation later, but there's nothing officially recorded over on mainland Bali. And I suspect the case is the same for the other rural areas of Bali also.
Yeah, so that would take a whole study to figure out what percentage is being reported. You said something like, there's no markers on the graves or something. I said, well, there's umbrellas. And then you said, well, that's before they're cremated. So go on from there, would you?
Yeah. So if the family cannot afford the cremation ceremony at the time of the death, they bury the body until they have enough money saved for the cremation. Now,
right?
Yes, they do. And because they believe that when the body is in the ground, the person has not yet passed over the side and then properly dead yet. And can I tell you another funny story about that?
Yeah, sure.
So a friend of mine is a member of the temple, and one of his jobs is to actually dig up the bodies for the cremation ceremony. This is a Balinese friend on Nusa Lembongan Island. So one of his jobs is to dig the bodies up before the cremation, which they do at night time. And he explained to me that the person is not dead until they're cremated. And he told me that he knew this was true because he would bury the bodies in one position, and when he dug them up 3, 4, 5 years later, the body was in a different position.
That's cool.
Yeah. So that's why they place the umbrellas on them to give them shade, and they take them food, which they leave at the graveside. They take them drinks, they take them cigarettes, and anything else they might need while they're waiting underground.
Oh, wow. Oh, let me just point out one thing. The island of Lembongan, there's 3 islands just right off here, 30-minute boat ride away. And there's Lembongan, and then there's the big island of Benita, and then in between is the little island of Chinagan. And those are part of Bali. So then tell us about the diving experience you had.
I was a diving instructor based on Nusa Lembongan Island, and we have a dive site located maybe 150 meters offshore, just off the beach in front of the main village, which we call the house reef.
House, like a house people live in?
Yeah, it's a common name for a dive site that's off the shore located in front of a hotel or a village. So I was diving there one morning with student divers, and it's a nice, shallow, sandy site. And I was quite surprised to see a 100,000 rupiah bill on the sand. So I swam over and picked up the money. which is around $8, David.
No, it's about $6.50 now.
Yeah. And I smiled at my students, and I took the money and put it in my pocket. And then as we were swimming around, we found more and more money, a lot of money. And I was very happy. And I assumed if someone had dropped a wallet or a purse over the side of a boat. And when we got back to the dive center, I started taking the money out of my pockets, and I explained to the Balinese dive shop owner, Putu, we had found this money, and she carefully explained to me that there had been a ceremony the evening before after a cremation where they had made the offerings into the sea. So, of course, I was mortally embarrassed and offered to get back on the boat and take the money back. But Putu explained to me that it's the Balinese tradition that once an offering has been made, then whatever happens to it is the will of the gods. It still didn't stop me from feeling terrible, though.
Oh, yeah. Well, you're favored by the gods. That is great.
They obviously understood that diving instructors' salaries are not so good.
So after a cremation, then the ashes are put into the ocean after a while or right away? Or
As soon as the fire has died down and the ashes have cooled off, then the ladies actually sift through the ashes and they remove the bones. And they are searching for the hand bones. And the finger bones that they find in hand bones, they arrange them on a banana leaf in the shape of actual hands. They almost reconstruct the hand bones. And then those bones are taken over to the mother temple of Sakti, which is the main temple on mainland Bali. And there's a ceremony there. The remainder of the ashes, yes, they have a ceremony on the beach in Bongan, and they put the ashes in a ceramic pot, and they actually put it on a small raft and send it out into the sea.
I've seen in Singaraja, I had a friend who was cremated, a German fellow, had a motorbike accident. No, he wasn't German, he's Austrian. And what they were doing in Singaraja, it looked to me like we're just going down to the water, because this is in front of a crematorium there. And so there was stuff happening all the time at various stages of the ceremonies. And they were just throwing stuff in the water with baskets and flowers and offerings and, various things. So I guess that happens too. They're really used to putting things into the water. And it's hard. I know I have a friend who has a guest house down in Buitan near Chandidasa. It's really cool to stay at, sort of a hippie place. They bake their own bread and have a kiln. Lumbundamu. Anyway, she said it's very distressing to her when she sees old ladies coming down to the ocean and just dumping all their trash into the ocean, plastic and everything. And, and she's Indonesian, although she sounds like she's from Southern California. She's never lived in America. But she said, she's tried to talk to them about it, but that's what they always did. The ocean was, their wastebasket, and the creeks and rivers. So it's hard for them to change that. But they are changing little by little. More so in Java, I hear.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've experienced plenty of that, plenty of plastic in the ocean when you're diving.
Yeah, the problem is that the plastic came to Indonesia very quickly, and previously when they were throwing their waste in the ocean, it was all banana leaves and organic matter.
Right.
And the plastic didn't come with instructions on how to dispose of it, unfortunately.
Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
Well, thank you most kindly, Sarah. And we look forward to speaking to you again in another episode of Life in Bali.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, probably see you tomorrow.
Okay. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. We have Peter Schneider with us. Peter was a very early student of Suzuki Roshi and pretty much ran Tassajara in the early days. Was ordained as a priest and went to Japan and lived there many years. And now he and his wife Jane, who's also ordained and who was also a Suzuki Roshi student, live in near our part of Los Angeles. What is it, Northridge?
Yeah, Northridge. It is Los Angeles.
Yeah. So tell us about your group there and living there, whatever.
Well, Jane and I were in Japan for 22 years.
Wow.
And we came back in 1995, and I didn't work for a while. And then I found a job here, and I'd always planned to go to San Francisco finally, but it just didn't work out that way. So there I was in L.A., and now I've been here 25 years.
Oh, my gosh. How the time flies.
You know, one time, David, I was, when I first met Suzuki Roshi, and I was living in San Francisco, and a friend of mine said, let's go to Los Angeles. And he had a used pink Cadillac with the top down, and with the top down, I didn't have work yet. I graduated from school several months before, but I was kind of footloose. And so I said, sure. And then, so we drove down on 101, but somehow it's not quite 101 because somehow we were in Malibu.
Yeah, you went into one at some point. I used to do the same thing.
Yeah. And then when we got to Malibu, I turned to the person that I was with and said, I don't want to go to L.A. And I got out of the car and I hitchhiked back to San Francisco.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so it was really strange that when I ended up in Los Angeles, I had that Central California arrogance at that time. You know, San Francisco and the whole thing. But here I am very happily in LA.
Yeah.
Jane and I are the Southern California outpost, as it were, for the San Francisco Zen Centers. San Francisco is Beginner's Mind Temple.
Mm-hmm.
When we first had our name was Northridge Zen Center. And then one of our members, who was a real go-getter, convinced us that really didn't represent us. And he wanted us to call ourselves, Beginner's Mind Zen Center. And although I wasn't quite aware of the extent to which it was used in San Francisco, I knew that they had, the temple was named the Pay Street was named that.
Oh yeah, it's the Beginner's Mind Temple. I forget that. I'm used to calling it the city center.
And I asked a few people unofficially who were, leaders in San Francisco if they would mind if I used the name.
Oh, that's thoughtful.
And they said no. They said no. I said okay. Anyway, so we're Beginner's Mind Zen Center.
Yeah.
And we've been that for we began in 2003. So we've been here, and it's probably after about 4 years we changed our name.
Mm-hmm.
So now we've been that for more than 10 years anyway. Actually, this same person that I was in the car with going down to L.A. was psychic. He was a psychic guy who did readings. And so I met him, and we hung out. Other people hung out with him. He's an older guy. So anyway, he said, but I was footloose, couldn't find work, and was not particularly happy. And he said, quit smoking, which seemed to me can be completely off the wall. How's that going to do anything at all? But I was open to anything. So I quit smoking. And it worked. It worked. I kind of got my will back. And then after maybe 2 months of that, by that time I had a job anyway. And then he said, okay, now start meditating. Another person was named, may or may not know this name, but probably you don't. David McCain, his name is. He'd been my roommate for a short time. He stayed at my house. He was a friend of my brother's. And David McCain worked with Dick Baker.
Oh.
They both worked as stocking clerks or shipping clerks in Bookman or Book something in San Francisco.
Uh-huh.
It was a well-known company at that time, I believe. Anyway, so therefore, Dick was there. He was part of our group, or there wasn't a group actually, but we were all hanging out together. And then a lot of people left, including David, and Dick had found a Suzuki Roshi, and he knew that I sat, and he kept hounding me to go to Zen Center.
I see now.
And I finally said, all right, I'll do it.
Wow.
And I did, and it worked out very well. Worked out very well.
So Richard Baker brought you to Zen Center. That's interesting.
Yes, he did, definitely. I probably would not have gotten there on my own.
Yeah.
Because my interest was in meditation, not in Buddhism at that point.
Right.
I was just meditating.
Yeah.
All. So then I was working in Silicon Valley when it was Transistor Valley.
Oh.
It was very old, early times before chips, and I didn't have a car, but I hitchhiked up Friday night in order to go to the Saturday morning program, and I stayed a couple of days with Dick.
You were there pretty early. That was about 63, right?
Well, no, that was 60. Well, I'm not quite certain whether it was 61 or the winter of 62.
No, that was 62 because Dick only came in the spring of 61.
Yeah, and so therefore I sat my first. When I sat it must have been the winter time, and so I sat that first time, and then and it was memorable because there was a young priest who you have met, I think, named, because he went to L.A., named Kato.
Oh yeah, Kato. Oh yeah, Kazumitsu Kato.
Anyway, he was about 30 years old, and he'd been there helping Suzuki Roshi for a couple of years or so.
He's still alive.
I've met him. Yeah, I've met him a couple of times. He gave a talk during the second day of the 2-day, and his talk was about why I'm leaving Zen. So it was really surprising. And what he did is he went down to get his PhD, and then he taught, I think, at UCLA also. It was just striking to have a guy been reading a Zazenkai and talking about why he was quitting. But it wasn't discouraging. It was just kind of funny.
Yeah.
And then we never saw him again.
He's a very straightforward guy.
Yes, he's a very nice man.
Yeah.
I'd met him 2 or 3 times. I'd met him a couple of times, and I've sat and talked with him because I would go down to a couple times to Zen Suji behind the curtains and all.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I couldn't find any work. I wanted to be an English teacher at a university, and I couldn't find any work I just had a master's. But anyway, so Dick got a job working at Berkeley in the extended learning, or continuous learning, whatever it's called. And that was a job for the next 5 years.
Extension.
Until he began working full time. Extension, yeah. I would help him edit some stuff occasionally. He was given the job to write a newsletter. So anyway, so there I was. I was working, going up on the weekends, and then, but I found this job in Michigan. So I wanted to work. So I planned to leave and take this 2-year job. It was a 2-year contract. Actually, teaching freshman English. The week before I left to get my job, they had a 7-day sesshin, and I lived. I was the only person who was doing that, but I spent the night in the temple in Bush Street.
Yeah.
But I was sitting between Dick and who was the English chemist? What was his name? Pecci.
Oh, Graham Pecci.
Graham was first in the row, then I was next, and then Dick was next. So anyway, and they were both, really strong sitters. They didn't move. So I didn't move either. But I was kind of new. We were all new, of course. I've been sitting less than a year, 9 months, and they've been sitting 2 years, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that was an old student back then. So in the middle of the third day, I started to cry.
Uh-huh.
And that's the only time that ever happened. Actually, the only time I actually cried, in any time since, I have no idea. Oh, when I was 13, I think. And I started to cry, and I walked out of the room, and I went down the stairs, and it's on the second floor, of course. You were there, and I sat down on the stairs and was weeping, as it were. And he came down, and Suzuki Roshi, just walked out. I didn't run out or just walked down the stairs, and I was crying. But I was crying quite strongly. I wasn't just weeping. I was bawling, I think. So I have this experience of him coming down and of just not saying much at all. But I went back up, right away, and that was the end of it. But I had a very strong feeling from him at that time. I can't put it into words or anything special, but it was a strong experience. He came down and just did something that comforted me, and I remember that experience really, really strongly. So I went to Michigan, and I taught English, and I was still doing meditation and all. There was a professor there who was a Democrat, and at that point, Kalamazoo, which is where Western Michigan was part of the conservative part of Michigan. And so every year, 2 years, he would run for Congress, knowing that he would lose.
Yeah.
Okay, that was his job. He taught political science, but he knew the people. He knew Washington somehow. He knew about what was going on, and the U.S. at that point was sending rice, mostly rice, but I guess wheat too also, to India. And the deal they worked with India was they would pay them in rupees. The money couldn't leave India, but the U.S. got paid. Okay? So this teacher came up with the idea of, I'll take a bunch of people to India.
Mm.
And so so the word went out that that students only could sign up to go to India for free for the summer. Everything was free, 100% free.
Wow.
And the round the world trip and the whole works. Okay. And so, and I was teaching, and but when I heard about it, because I knew him, and then I quickly signed up for a class, and I took a grad school class.
Yeah.
In order to be a student. So I was able to go. And a lot of my friends went too, student friends. But I didn't want to go to India. I wanted to go to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
That was my idea. I wanted to go to Japan. So if I had to go to India to go to Japan, I'd go to Japan because the trip was going to spend 2 weeks there.
Oh.
Okay.
All right. That's quite a...
Okay. So
yeah.
So we were in the something called the Government House in Tokyo back in 1963, the year before the Olympics, and so when I was there, someone set up for me. I wanted to go down and see Suzuki Temple. So someone set up for me the ability to go down there. I didn't, of course, didn't even know. I probably knew sayonara, but that's about it. And so I got on the train and went down there. It was a regular train. I got off the train and took a taxi, and I got there. Oh, this is Rinzo Inn.
Right.
Suzuki Temple, where
right.
That's where he was from, and I wanted to see a temple because that was part of my plan to go to Japan was to go see a temple.
Yeah.
I didn't tell him about it. I just wanted to go. So I went there, and when I got there, he was there. Yes, he's 63. His first time back.
Uh-huh.
And he was there, and Gene Ross was there.
Oh, yeah.
At that point. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I spent just a night there, but it was very, very nice. And but I saw him then. And then after that, when we sat in the Zendo, Hoichi was at Eiheiji at that time.
Uh-huh.
So, it was very nice there. One story, the only story that I can remember, we talked and was very nice, and it was just so natural. I've always felt Suzuki was the most natural person I ever met.
Mm.
He was just easy, for me in particular, I guess. But for me anyway, easy to get along with. Just felt just so ordinary with him.
Yeah.
It was just very, very nice. And so, but then next morning, whoever made the food, I think it must have been his grandmother. I don't know who made it, because it wasn't, someone made ham and eggs for us.
I think that would be his mother-in-law. She was still around then, I think.
But the ham and eggs was really fried, super fried. Okay.
Uh-huh.
So it was of course edible, and so they asked me if I'd like to have seconds, and I said, no, thank you. It tasted terrible. Not terrible, but I didn't like it anyway, right? And he picked it up and put it in front of me. So I had to eat the second egg with the piece of, I don't know, just ham in it. But that was one of my first Zen lessons, was eating the ham. And Gene Ross told the story, and so Dick knew the story from Gene Ross. Anyway, so time passed. I lived in 6 different places from that point on. You know how we traveled in those days. New York, Florida, Upper New York State. Of course, I was in India for 2 months, and then I was in Spain for 4 months, and 2 months or 2.5 months in England. And I moved around and then back to New York City. And I was living in New York City, and I had a job again, this time once again as a tech writer. That's what I had, my first job was. And during that other period, I hadn't been a tech writer. But anyway, I was a tech writer again, and I just quit my job. And Dick had asked me to set up a meeting for Suzuki Roshi to give a talk. 67 in the wintertime.
That's when he went to the East Coast trying to get money for Tassajara.
Exactly. So he was there. He was there. I was living there in my own apartment, and Dick had made a friend with the person who was the on the scene hippie scene writer for the Village Voice.
Oh.
Okay, young guy. He was like 22, and we became friends. And I would go out to these happenings that were happening. So, and Dick had made a poster for the benefit in which all the people, the Grateful Dead and etc., who for Zen Center out at the beach, right?
No, that was at the Avalon Ballroom, the Zenefit. Let's see, it was November of the year before, 1966, and it had the Grateful Dead, Big Brother in the Holding Company with Janis Joplin, and the Quicksilver Messenger Service, and light show by Bill Ham, who had a little garage he worked out of pretty near the old Sokoji. Yeah, wow, and you had that poster.
Very nice, very zen-y looking poster, and I took that poster and somehow pasted in the information about Suzuki Roshi giving a talk in the village, where I lived in Soho at that point, but it wasn't called Soho. And this guy and I went out and we put up posters all over the village. And then Suzuki Roshi came to give the talk, and we charged $1 a person.
Huh.
And 600 people came.
Oh my God.
600 people. Imagine that. And it was a famous place. It was a famous place for modern things. 2nd Avenue and 12th Street or something like that. Maybe Episcopalian.
Peter still hadn't remembered the name later. Richard Baker said he thought he would be able to remember it, but Michael Katz came through. St. Mark's in the Bowery on East 10th near 2nd Avenue. And yes, it's Episcopalian.
And then the next day, I was met Suzuki Roshi again, and he said, "Come to Tassajara and be the office manager."
Oh, Suzuki Roshi said that, not Dick?
No, yeah, and it worked out. I once asked Dick about it, and it wasn't his idea. It was Suzuki Roshi's idea.
I always assumed Dick had asked you.
I did too, but it wasn't. It wasn't Dick.
He would have. You were the right person for that. That's fine.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, Suzuki Roshi, I guess because of the fact that I could pull off, as it were. I didn't pull it off, so I just did very ordinary stuff. But anyway, that it worked out. But of course, he wanted a student to come back.
Yeah.
But I said to him, "Well, I'd like to do it, but I can't afford the airplane," which was true, And he said, "Well, you have $600."
Oh, that's great.
And I said, "Sure." And I thought in my mind I'd go out for several months, So that was that. So there I was at Tassajara.
Wow, that is cool.
Backdoor Zen, I call it backdoor Zen. It wasn't my plan to go to Tassajara and spend the rest of my life studying Buddhism. Suzuki Roshi was extremely unassuming, and he had really strong confidence, but he didn't have the kind of confidence that bowled people over.
Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki. Chapter 2, Master and Disciple, 1916 to 1923. When my master and I were walking in the rain, he would say, "Do not walk so fast. The rain is everywhere." Soon stepped off the train at the village of Mori. Behind him followed a new disciple, his young and very small devotee, Toshitaka Suzuki. They walked through the countryside and up a hill to the temple. Carrying his belongings, Toshi climbed a steep flight of stone steps to enter the grounds through a high old thatch-roofed temple gate. Although he was moving only from one temple to another, he was also entering into a new setting that would totally change his life. He showed up in the middle of the 100-day practice period. 8 students had joined Soon for this training, including some monks and some young trainees. Toshi was the youngest. There were no small children or women in the temple. While not huge, Zon-in was much larger and more impressive than Shoganji. There were many more rooms with tatami and wood floors, a spacious main hall with a fine central altar holding a Buddha statue, and side altars for other revered figures, a founder's hall in back, and beautiful grounds, not extensive, but with well-tended gardens. Toshi was taken to the room where the students slept. He put his belongings in a dark wood cabinet under which a futon was stored. He had never before lived with such a demanding schedule. Everyone rose at 4 in the morning and sat zazen, Zen meditation. Then there was a service where they chanted sutras, followed by a thorough temple cleaning, which the students carried out vigorously. They dusted, swept, and wiped the woodwork down with damp cloths. They ran down the wood floors, bent over, pushing the towels before them. Even in the cold morning, they wore only kimonos and thin underwear, no warm layers of monks' robes. After a breakfast of white rice with raw egg, miso soup, fish, and pickles, some of the younger boys who were permanent residents went off to school. For Toshi, there was work all day, and then more zazen in the evening. He had to learn how to sit in this lotus posture with legs crossed instead of the traditional seiza, sitting in a kneeling position on the shins with bottom on heels. He was told nothing about zazen except just to sit and not to move. Toshi did not become homesick because the activity at Zonin was so invigorating and because he was in love with Soon. Buddhism was not what motivated him. He had only vague, simplistic ideas of what it was. It was Soun who inspired him. Toshi focused on Soun, throwing himself into serving his new master, much as Soun had served Sogaku 25 years before. When Sogaku became the abbot of Zounin in 1891, he asked the temple elders for a young boy to be his student, and he received a 14-year-old orphan. Sogaku adopted the boy and ordained him, giving him the Buddhist name Gyokujun Soon and his own family name Suzuki. Sogaku sent Soun to school, and before the turn of the century, he entered the Soto Zen College in Tokyo. After 3 years there, Soun went to the famous training temple of Shuzenji on the Izu Peninsula south of Tokyo. There he studied with the great Oka Sotan, who had been the head of the Soto Zen College when Soun had attended. Oka was a recognized scholar and author of several books on Buddhism. He emphasized the practice of zazen and the careful study of Buddhist teachings, especially the precepts, the guidelines of conduct. Continuing the work of his master Nishiari Bokusan, Oka was a leader in the resurgence of interest in studying the lengthy Shobogenzo, Treasury of the True Dharma Eye. This book is the masterwork of Eihei Dogen, the 13th century monk and founder of Japanese Soto Zen, whose voluminous, profound writings are now generally considered a pinnacle of Zen philosophical expression. Following tradition, Gyokujun Soun received Dharma transmission, authorization to teach, from his first teacher, the priest who ordained him, Sogaku Suzuki, and took his place in that lineage. But his understanding of Buddhism had matured under Oka Sotan. Soun flourished at Shuzenji and went on to become the chief administrator of the temple. In 1916, Soun left Shuzenji to become the abbot of Zounin, the temple of his early training. Thus, although Sogaku had departed from Zounin 13 years prior to that time, he had managed to keep it within his lineage through his disciple Soun, who had gained a reputation as a good administrator. It was not long after Soun assumed the abbotship of Zounin that his master's son, Toshitaka Suzuki, arrived at Zounin to begin his new life. Soun carried himself with a fierce authority. His presence was everywhere. When he couldn't be seen, he was felt. Soun was the man who stood commandingly where Sogaku wished to be, in Zounin. Big and strong, Soun had long practiced Kyudo, the way of archery. One day, when a guest at the temple asked Soun about an exceedingly tall bow that hung on the wall, he called his disciples and announced there would be a Kyudo demonstration. He took the long, thick bow, taller than he was, and had Toshi set up a straw target. After placing an arrow in the bow with the same attention he devoted to offering a stick of incense at the altar, he pulled the string back slowly and deeply and let the arrow fly. Turning to the boys, he asked them to try to pull back the bowstring. One by one they tried but couldn't budge it, even though some of them were older teenagers, not weaklings at all. The guests then tried and couldn't bend the bow either. The demonstration was over. Son related to Toshi gruffly, mainly ignoring him, but also giving him some slack because he was so young. If Toshi didn't rise with the wake-up bell, nothing was said to him. He tried, but it was hard. Many mornings he'd go back to sleep, and his eyes would next open when he heard the sounds of the Heart Sutra coming from the Buddha Hall. Kanji Saibo Satsugyo Jinhanya Haramita. At Shoganji, he'd heard his father chant that alone in the mornings and with others in ceremonies. Not long after Toshi's arrival, the aging Okasotan came with his close disciple of many years, Keiza. They were referred to reverently by Son as Oka Roshi and Keiza Roshi, Roshi being a term of respect for older priests. Seeing his master with them, observing the strictness with which they all conducted themselves, Toshi felt he was in the midst of the greatness he had heard of. His task in life was to be like them. I was lucky to be there and encouraged by them, but the difficult thing was to get up in the morning as they did. This was the first lesson Toshi learned at his new temple. It took time and nobody would help him, but eventually he discovered that he could do it if he jumped out of bed before he had a thought. Once he knew how, he never went back. It became a lifelong practice and teaching of his. When the bell rings, get up. Karma can change into a vow. On May 18, 1917, his 13th birthday, Toshi was ordained as a novice monk. He received the precepts, took the vows, and formally became a disciple of Gyokujun Soon. He also received a set of black robes to go over his Japanese kimono, a kuromo, the Chinese outer robe with long sleeves, an okesa, a large rectangular cloth with finely sewn sections in 7 rows resembling rice fields, the sacred robe of the monk, and a raksu, a miniature and less formal okesa with straps, which is worn on the chest and over the shoulders like a bib. He was given the Buddhist name of Shogaku Shunryu. Shogaku, auspicious peak, was combined with his birth name Shunryu, excellent emergence. He was called Shunryu-san by his fellow students. Son had taken to calling him Crooked Cucumber, a private nickname for his absent-minded, idealistic, quirky little disciple. Life with Son was harsh. Even in the winter, they weren't allowed to wear tabi, the socks worn with zori. On the cold wood floors where young Shunryu would often work all day, some of the boys would walk on tiptoe when Soun wasn't looking so as to reduce the amount of skin that came in contact with the freezing floor. Soun suspected that the only reason the boy was at Zounin was to inherit the temple from him and to return it to his family. He was obligated to his master Sogaku to train the little fellow, but if the basis of his being there was such an ambition, then he wouldn't make a good priest. In addition, Soun still had some feelings about Sogaku, who had been a severe and unsentimental master himself. Soun taunted Shunryu about his father, whom Shunryu loved and felt loyal to, and who had mellowed since the time of Soun's apprenticeship. There was nothing Toshi could do but listen to Soun. He told the boy how Sogaku had often hit him on the head when he was young, a common disciplinary practice of the time, and claimed that it had made him dim-witted. Soun said that once when he got into mischief, Sogaku had hung him upside down on the temple gate. Soun sent Shunryu to the village upper elementary school, but did not provide him with proper clothes. His kimonos were old and tattered. A woman who lived near the temple took pity on the boy and made some new kimonos out of scraps, but they had a different pattern on each sleeve. He was so embarrassed at his appearance that he'd wear his coat even during physical education, saying he was sick. In winter, he was never warm enough. Though his family at Kanagawa had been poor, and he didn't have as much as the other boys, at least his mother had always sewn him good kimonos, so he never had to suffer this sort of indignity. Zounin wasn't that poor a temple, so there was no reason for this except to test his endurance. We say, only to sit on a cushion is not Zen. The Zen master's everyday life, character, and spirit is Zen. My own master said, I will not accept any monastery where there is lazy training, where the rooms are full of dust. He was very strict. To sleep when we sleep, to scrub the floor and keep it clean, that is our Zen. So practice is first, and as a result of practice, there is teaching. To sleep when we sleep, to scrub the floor and keep it clean, that is our Zen. So practice is first, and as a result of practice, there is teaching. Instead of complaining and asking to be taken back home, Shunryu tried to show his sincerity through his actions. Taking to heart Soun's admonitions on daily practice, Shunryu applied himself with energy in each activity, especially cleaning. He vowed to clean the blackened kitchen pans and surfaces. All the boys worked in the kitchen, and some of them were lazy cleaners. Soun said that Dogen, in his instructions to the cook, had emphasized the importance of finding liberation in kitchen work. So Shunryu threw himself into scrubbing off the layers of soot that came from smoky, open-fire cooking. Then I felt some joy in cleaning the smut off the pans. In this way, each of us must have some vow. Then we will find joyful mind and big mind and kind mind. When we clean because of our vow, we will find that we are kind to everyone instead of angry. That is bodhisattva mind. After a while, Shunryu's conscientious efforts softened Big Soon a bit. While continuing to be tough, imperious, and critical of Shunryu and his father, Soon began to take the boy seriously and to respect his motives. The honeymoon phase was over. Now Soon wanted more from Shunryu than puppy love. He wanted him to listen to the intent of his teaching, get beyond his limiting idealism, meet him on the Dharma ground. Soon told a story about the Chinese ancestor Yakusan, who emphasized to his disciples that he was not a philosopher or a scholar, but a teacher of Zen. "Do not acknowledge me," he kept saying to his disciples. His point was the opposite of what he was saying. Acknowledge me. His disciples didn't accept him or relate to him as a Zen teacher, but always expected him to be something else, to fulfill some other role. It is the character or personality, the cross-current of teacher and disciple, that makes transmission and real lineage Zen possible. The relationship between the teacher and disciples is quite important for us. I didn't know it at the time, but the first problem given me by my master was this story about Yakusan. I could not acknowledge my master for a long time. It is quite difficult to believe in your teacher. Our practice should be based on the idea of selflessness. Selflessness is very difficult to understand. If you try to be selfless, that is already a selfish idea. Selflessness will be there when you do not try anything. When you are practicing with a good teacher, you will naturally not be so selfish. The boys were cleaning out the temple pond, scraping the mud from the bottom. Soun was working at the edge. Shunryu reached down and caught a little goldfish and noticed that there was a tiny worm attached to it. He had learned about this worm in school. He held the fish up, pointed to the worm, and proudly said for all to hear, "This is Mijinko." "Shut up," Soun barked at him. Shunryu didn't understand why Soun shouted at him, but much later he told the story to show how Soun was actually watching, ready to pounce on any sign of selfishness. To encourage a student by setting a good example is one sort of mercy. To shout at me when I was proudly showing off was another sort of mercy, another kindness. Soun did not have any particular teaching or system, and his students were often in the dark about what they should be doing or how they should be doing it. Suzuki said that Soun was usually silent, so much so that his disciples had to learn most things on their own, just watching what he did. But they weren't necessarily supposed to be doing exactly what he did, so they'd get nervous and feel lost. Suzuki said they actually developed a liking for the sound of Soun's scolding voice because then they knew what to do, how to clean a pond with concentration and selflessness was one thing, but Soon was also mute when it came to more complicated subjects, such as how to conduct a memorial service. The boys often went out with Soon to perform services in the homes of Danka. The details of what they chanted and how they went about it were always changing, and the nuances of how to strike the bells and mokugyo, the wooden fish drum, how and when to bow, and so forth, were so various and subtle that they could never do it quite right. Right in front of a family seated solemnly before them, Soon would look over at Shunryu hitting the bell and would suddenly growl, "What are you doing?" Then he'd take the striker out of Shunryu's hand and show him how it was done. It was embarrassing, but at least in that way he'd been shown something. Later, Suzuki said that through this sort of study, he learned how to apply himself to new problems without preparation, developing confidence in his ability to meet situations as they arose. Returning from such a memorial service one summer evening, having been well fed and carrying gifts of food, the boys walked with Soun on a path in the twilight. Soun had taken the tabi off his feet at the door and slipped them into the sleeve of his robe, but the boys still had their tabi on. When they reached a wooden area, he told them to go first, since they were wearing tabi, and it was the time of year when mamushi, the poisonous snakes, would be out. Mamushi are not large snakes, and tabi offer a certain amount of protection, so the boys said, "Hi!" and went ahead, feeling like brave monks. When they got to the temple, Soun said, "Why don't you boys sit down?" They knew something was up, but had no idea what. "I knew you boys were not so alert," he told them, "but I didn't know you were that dull. When I am not wearing tabi, why do you wear them? You should have noticed." Then the boys were deeply ashamed. They were not supposed to be dressed more formally than their teacher. This subtle and indirect way of communicating is what Suzuki later called listening to the other side of the words. Soun kept cakes and other goodies on hand to serve to guests who dropped by the temple. The boys, usually hungry, were always pilfering these treats. He kept hiding them in new places, but his young disciples would find them. Once he put a jar of sugar high on a shelf in the kitchen. They saw it and figured out what it was. They brought a table over and put a short ladder on top of that. One of them got on the ladder, and another climbed on top of him and grabbed the pot, but before he could get down, they lost their balance and came crashing to the floor, breaking the pot. That got them a tongue lashing. They'd find a cake and take off little slices so that he wouldn't notice. Later, they'd go back and cut the corners off. Finally, they'd realize that they were going to get caught anyways. So they'd divide it up and eat it all. He wouldn't get angry at them for this sort of mischief, but if he thought someone had taken something to eat all by himself, he'd get very angry. Once, Soun put a large persimmon in the rice so it would ripen there. When he came to get it, it was gone. He asked who had eaten it. Shunryu said he didn't know. Soun found out who ate it and gave the thief hell, not because he took the persimmon, but because he hadn't shared it. Shunryu regretted that he hadn't taken the blame. Suzuki's favorite story about his novice days with Soun was a cautionary tale, not of selfishness, but of discrimination, and of pickles gone bad. At Zone Inn, pickles were made to eat year-round, but especially in the winter when there were few fresh vegetables. There were pickles made from cucumbers, carrots, eggplants, cabbage, and daikon, the giant white radishes. A batch of takuan, daikon pickles, had been undersalted and gone bad. Soun was told about it. He was just like Sogaku when it came to food. He wouldn't throw it out. "Serve it anyway," he ordered. So for meal after meal, decomposing daikon were served, and the pickles were getting worse with the passage of time. One night, when they could take it no more, after they were sure someone was asleep, Shunryu and a couple of his cohorts took the pickles out to the garden and buried them. The boys were pleased with themselves, thinking they had gotten away with their prank. But a few days later, when they sat down for breakfast at the low wooden table, Soun brought in a special gift: the rotten pickles back from the dead. Soun ate the pickles with them. Shunryu gathered his courage and took the first bite, then the next. He found that he could do it if he didn't think about it. He said it was his first experience of non-discriminating consciousness. If we have surrendered to our Master, we employ all our effort to control our mind so that we may exist under all conditions, extraordinary and ordinary. The pickle saga wasn't quite over, though. The boys decided to boil them to see if that helped. It did. They were much easier to eat. Soun said, "What is this? You boys must have cooked something extraordinary." And then they all ate the cooked rotten pickles together. He never asked his students to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Sometimes it is better for your teacher to be mean, so you don't attach to him. When Shunryu arrived at Zone Inn, there were 8 boys studying with Soun. After the first year, there were only 4, and midway through the second year, they too had gone. Soun was not just hard on Shunryu. One by one, the boys had been driven away by his imperious manner and the privations they had to endure with him. Now it was just Shunryu and Soun. He had a lot of responsibility for a 14-year-old. There was schoolwork, cooking, cleaning, memorial services in homes, assisting with ceremonies at the temple, and serving Soun and his guests. Shunryu was lonely without his friends, but he was getting lots of personal attention. That often didn't work out the way he wanted it to. For instance, he had some resistance to making full bows, down on the knees with forehead descending to touch the bowing cloth and hands extended palms up. Soun noticed Shunryu's resistance and told him that from that day, instead of bowing in this way 3 times to Buddha at the end of services, they would bow 9 times. Sometimes being alone with Soun did work out to Shunryu's liking. He got to work more in the gardens and to move stones with Soun, who was a rather accomplished stonemason. On a trip to Shuzenji, a monk had shown Shunryu the bell tower, the stone base of which Soun had built when he was young. The monk said that a master stonemason had inspected it and commented that it was built by an amateur. He knew because it was too precise. A hard part of being alone with Sohn was that now Shunryu had to carry everything when they went places. One day there was a service in the next valley, a few miles away, and Sohn sent Shunryu ahead with a small trunk and a bag of scrolls. Sohn went down to the village to get a jinrickshaw, the two-wheeled taxi of the time that was pulled by a man on foot. Shunryu stopped to rest his feet on the way and went down to a riverbank to catch frogs and let them go. Enjoying himself, he forgot the time until he saw Sohn crossing the bridge. Shunryu hid till Sohn had passed, then took the shortcut over the hill. He arrived huffing and puffing just before his master. After a ceremony and a short sermon, they ate a big meal, and Sohn headed home. Shunryu received an offering envelope from the family. The scrolls were to stay there, so he thought his trip back would be lighter. But the wife gave him a box with melons and a pumpkin. Then she said, "As it's so hot, how about this watermelon?" So he thanked her and trudged back to Zone Inn, loaded down with gifts. Day after day, it was like that. "I saw you under the bridge playing," Sohn said, wagging a finger at Shunryu. "You crooked cucumber. You're sticking with it, but I feel sorry for you. You're such a dimwit." Shunryu wanted to leave Sohn just as the other boys had, but he couldn't go back home now. Actually, his parents would have loved for him to come back home, but he didn't see that as an option. He had visited his family a couple of times since his ordination, and his father had been proud to see his son greet him so properly and formally with his hakama skirt tied correctly. There had been no complaints from Shunryu's lips or talk of his return. "My master always called me, 'You crooked cucumber.' I understand pretty well that I am not so sharp. I was the last disciple, but I became the first one because all the good cucumbers ran away. Maybe they were too smart. Anyway, I was not smart enough to run away, so I was caught. For studying Buddhism, my dullness was an advantage. A smart person doesn't always have the advantage, and a dull person is sometimes good because he is dull. Actually, there is no dull person or smart person. They are all the same." Don't Don't commit adultery, crooked Pardon. "Don't commit adultery, crooked cucumber." Shunryu had been admiring an old tea bowl, and that is how Sohn told him not to be so attached to fine things. He used that metaphor a lot with the boy, who had good taste in antiques and craftsmanship. Shunryu found it funny because there were no women living in the temple, but that wasn't the point. It was not that Shunryu shouldn't appreciate beauty, just that he shouldn't be caught by it. The irony about Sohon's choice of words was that there was a woman in Sohon's life. She wasn't living in the temple, but she visited a lot, and she was married. Her name was Yoshi Marushichi, the daughter of a family in Mori that sold tofu. She had married a local rice merchant whose family was associated with Zoonin. She was smart and attractive, with a reputation for flattering others to get her way. Sohon was much more interesting and manly than her husband, who was older and in poor health. Soun was 41 at the time, and she 28. Shunryu knew her pretty well. She'd been spending more and more time at the temple, and she'd caught on to Soun's habit of kicking the boy around. People said they treated Shunryu like a stepson. They used him to relay messages back and forth. It wasn't really his calling. He'd get to the rice shop and realize he'd left the letter back on his desk. And several times he lost letters. Yoshi got very angry with him about that, and Soun had a fit. This might have been the reason that everyone knew about their relationship, though any type of secret would have been hard to keep in such a small community. No one did anything to stop their trysts, but there was general disapproval. It was a contributing factor to Soun's loss of students. One day, Soun sent Shunryu to the rice shop with a gift for Yoshi, and she sent him back with a covered wooden tub of a special high-quality rice cooked with edible mountain orchids. Shunryu had to smell the delectable fragrance all the way to the temple, but had been instructed not to taste it. He didn't like being their go-between, but he accepted the situation and continued serving his master. As things began to get uncomfortable around Mori, a new development relieved the situation. In 1918, Soun was asked by his superiors in the Soto sect to become the abbot of a temple named Rinsoin on the outskirts of Yaizu, a coastal town about 25 miles east of Mori toward Tokyo. He would be responsible for both temples, but a junior priest could handle most of his duties at Zounin. He wasn't being sent to Rinsoin just to get him out of Mori. Rinsoin was a moderately important temple that needed rejuvenation. It had seniority over 200 branch temples in the area and had around 500 Danka families. In the Meiji era, it had gone downhill and never really recovered, but before that time, it had been a bustling training temple. It was spacious and had a zendo, zazen hall, a bell tower, and much surrounding land that brought in revenue through rice payments from the tenant farmers. The prior abbot had not managed the temple properly and had resorted to selling temple possessions to make ends meet. It had become dilapidated, the thatch roof had to be replaced, all sorts of structural work needed to be done, and foxes and badgers had taken to living in some of the back rooms where the shoji screens had not been repaired for years. Many members had switched to other temples. Rinsoin needed to be pulled back together in every way, a job that would take years. Soun had a reputation with the Soto elders as a man who could do that, and the assignment would also get him out of Mori. Shunryu would go with him. It was almost time for him to leave Mori's upper elementary school. The plan was for him to attend the best middle school in the prefectural capital of Shizuoka, just a short train ride north. But he failed the entrance exam, a great embarrassment, so Soun told him to take a year off from school. He could study for the next test while at Rinsoin. With Shunryu's help, Soun started getting Rinsoin back into decent physical shape and improving Rinsoin's relationship with its branch temples. Members started returning, and the temple came back to life socially and spiritually. Soun made sure the farmers on temple land paid the proper share of their rice crop to the temple, going so far as to glower over them as they divided it up, grunting if he didn't feel the temple had gotten its due. He was known for his large stature, his air of importance, and his strict manner. The residents of Sakamoto, immediately below Rinso-in, were grateful for the restoration of prestige to their neighborhood and paid Soon the respect due to such a priest. Families started to send their boys to Soon for training, so Shunryu was no longer alone with his master. Soon's nephew, Soko, had come and taken his uncle as his master. There was a new disciple named Kendo Okamoto, to whom Shunryu became close. Two of Yoshi's nephews began to study with Soon too, which indicated that her family didn't mind their relationship. Shunryu was now the senior unsui, cloud water, or novice. Soon was well educated and perhaps felt bad about Shunryu's school situation. He started giving occasional classes to the boys in Japanese history and the Chinese classics. He taught them to read and write Old Chinese. This helped prepare them to study Buddhist texts, Chinese poetry, and calligraphy with other teachers who would come to the temple. Every morning they'd sweep the temple road down past the farmhouses till it looked as if it had been paved. They collected firewood from the woods above and helped Soon to plant more trees there. In spring they picked the top tender tea leaves from the rows of dark green tea hedges on the mountainside. They swept and wiped the temple clean daily and tended the gardens and ohaka, where the ashes of priests and danka were enshrined. One day, Shunryu's father showed up at Rinso-in and had tea with Soon. He asked for Shunryu to come home to visit his ailing mother. She missed him terribly, and Sogaku was afraid she would not get better if she didn't see her youngest boy. Sogaku missed him too, though he didn't express it so dramatically. But when Shunryu arrived home with his father, Yone immediately got well, and it was clear that the illness was just a ruse to get him there. Shunryu's parents asked if he wanted to live at home again, having heard many things through the clerical grapevine. They were upset about Soon's treatment of their son, uncomfortable about the affair with Yoshi, and dismayed that Shunryu had failed his middle school entrance exams. Sogaku had not had such opportunities and wanted his son to have a good education. The school at Mori had been inadequate, as the students generally didn't go on to higher education. Shunryu wished to stay with his master, and it was hard to argue with him, since he had become such a fine young monk. His manner did not attest to abuse, and his parents still believed that he could best train away from home in order to one day take over Zoun-in. They were torn between feelings for their boy Shunryu and the monk Shunryu. He decided for them. After staying a few days, he bid his parents farewell and returned to Rinso-in. Soun arranged for his students to study with another teacher for a while, a Rinzai Zen teacher. Before they left, Soun had some words of advice. Don't forget beginner's mind. Don't stick to any particular style of practice. When you go to a Soto temple, practice the Soto way. When you go to a Rinzai temple, practice the Rinzai way. Always be a new student. At the Rinzai temple, they studied a completely different type of Zen, which emphasized attainment of Satori, sudden enlightenment, through assiduous concentration on meditation teachings called koans, which pose such questions as, what was your original face before your parents were born? The boys were excited by the challenge. They were to concentrate on their koans in zazen, and throughout the day They weren't to talk about them, though. Shunryu endured the rigorous Rinzai training, but had trouble with his koan. Every morning and evening during zazen, he'd take his turn to visit the teacher, reciting the verse of his koan and presenting his answer. One day, one boy passed, then another. Finally, all but Shunryu had passed their koans. He became distraught. On the day they were to leave, he had still not passed his koan, and there were to be no more interviews, just a closing ceremony for their period of instruction. Just before the ceremony, Shunryu went running into the master's room and yelled out one last attempt to answer his koan to his master's satisfaction. Okay, you pass, the master said. Shunryu was happy. But later, he felt that he didn't really understand the koan and believed the master had just passed him to be nice. This left him with an unsatisfied feeling about koan practice, although he continued to read and reflect on them all of his life. Yoshi Marushichi's husband had died. Leaving her teenage son in care of the family, she moved into Rinzai. She did so formally, but at the same time rather secretly. Formally in that she took a new name, Shuko, which sounded like a nun's name, and was adopted as a Buddhist practitioner into the home of a Yaizu family that would be responsible for her while she lived at Rinzai. Secretly, in that she stayed in the temple as much as possible and did not socialize on the outside. Soen made their living quarters off-limits to the monks. They ate their meals together and sat around the warm hibachi in the evenings, separate from his disciples. Even though she wasn't particularly friendly, her presence did improve the atmosphere of the temple, and Soen himself became softer. The food improved, too. Everyone knew about Yoshi. They didn't know if she was a nun or cook or Soen's mistress. What they did know was that Soen was a man of character who did things in the proper way, and Yoshi's residence at the temple had occurred discreetly, in a recognized and traditional way. She was known as the Daikoku-sama of Rinzai. Daikoku-sama is one of the 7 gods of good fortune. He is not enshrined on the Buddhist or Shinto altars in homes or temples. His altars are in kitchens or entryways. According to legend, he stays at home when the other 5 good luck gods go to Izumo in October for the gathering of the gods. Daikoku represents bounty and is pictured sitting on bales of rice. In the Edo era, Buddhist priests did not marry, but temples were busy places, and the priests in many cases were somewhat worldly. Women began living in the temples, to work, and at times, to love. They did not show their faces because they weren't supposed to be there to begin with. These women were often called Daikoku-sama. I don't trust anything but my feet and my black cushion. My feet are always my friends. When I am really standing on my feet, I am not lost. Shunryu sat nodding in the train. It was 1921. He was 16 and wore a dark blue school uniform. Beside him was a backpack. He was dreaming of one good woman. Soen had at times spoken of one good woman, an old woman in whose home he did service once a year. She worked hard at home, doing chores all day for her son and his family, and as soon as the chanting started, she would fall asleep. Even though she was nodding while Sohn was chanting, she never missed hitting the bell at the right time. He said she never missed because she didn't stick to her personal problems. She looked sleepy, but was alert. There were a lot of stories like this in the monasteries, and they inspired Shunryu. He himself had learned how to get up on time without an alarm clock, and that had been a revelation to him. It made him trust his body and mind to take care of him. When the train stopped at the station, he woke up and got off. In 1919, when Shunryu was 15, Sogaku and Yone killed the deal with Sohn and took their son back to Shoganji from Rinsoin. This time, Shunryu had agreed, as had Sohn. In the minds of Shunryu's parents, maybe he'd get Zonin down the road, and maybe he wouldn't, but it wasn't worth sacrificing him for it. Yone had been complaining about her son's mistreatment for some time. Sogaku hadn't been so vocal, but as far as he was concerned, Sohn had been treating Shunryu as though he were a nuisance. 3 years was enough. Shunryu had passed the entrance examinations for middle school at Kaisei Chugaku, a first-rate institution. He commuted there by train. He'd have to redo most of the courses he'd taken in Mori with classmates 3 years younger than he. This wasn't unheard of at the time. In the countryside, anything past elementary school was higher education, and the few youngsters who went on did so as they could. When not in class at Kaisei, Shunryu helped his father with temple duties, performed services in people's homes, and gave his father the envelopes of money he received. He received special treatment at home and accepted it. He'd gotten used to that as a monk and as a male. His mother would make him special meals, different from what his sisters got. For the first time, he had friends who weren't monks and who did the normal things that boys do. When it got hot, he could be found with a schoolmate cooling off in the temple pond. He joined a boating club. One day a boy he knew drowned when his boat turned over. It took Shunryu a while to get over it. He couldn't swim either. Friends would come by the temple and they'd exchange plans. Once he brought home a tree so big he needed help to carry it. After school on snowy winter days, still carrying his school bag, he'd brush the snow off the branches and leaves of the flora around the temple before going inside. Even into his late teens, Shunryu's faults remained. Despite his kind nature, he had a short temper, though fortunately his bursts of anger would rise and fall quickly. He was a fairly quiet person until he got into an argument, and then he could be explosive. Shunryu had a compulsive weakness for sugar, an expensive item that lay people often gave to the temple as an offering. Shunryu regularly raided the big pot where it was kept, and when he got to the bottom, he'd add water and drink the rinse. After his mother put a stop to that, he hid a can of sugar by his desk so he could make hot sugar water. But Shunryu's most notorious weakness was absent-mindedness. He'd lose everything but his books and his mind. Everybody loses umbrellas, but Shunryu lost them in record numbers, mainly on trains. Once his mother stayed up all night making him a coat. She watched him walk off with his gaitered legs and new coat down the hill toward Iratsuka, where he got the train for Kaisei. He came home that evening without the coat. My habit is absent-mindedness. I am naturally very forgetful. I worked on it pretty hard, but could not do anything about it. I started to work on it when I went to my master at 12. Even then I was very forgetful, but by working on it steadily, I found I could get rid of my selfish way of doing things. If the purpose of practice and training is just to correct your weak points, I think it is almost impossible to change your habits. Even so, it is necessary to work on them because as you do so, your character will be trained and your ego will be reduced. When the 6-week summer vacation arrived, to his parents' surprise, Shunryu was off on a train to Yaizu to be back with Soon. He would continue to go there whenever he could to help out at Rinso-in and at Zounin, sometimes missing school. Shunryu had no intention of quitting his study with Soun, but he was getting a new perspective by living away from intense temple practice. The absence helped him realize how wonderful it was. Soun used to emphasize Dogen's teaching of beginner's mind, and this is when Shunryu first experienced it, because he was losing it. During this period, he experienced a sort of temptation, a clinging to purity, and an attachment to Zen. He was becoming aware of Buddhism in a new, self-conscious way. When we were little boys, we were all innocent Buddhas, even when we were 16 or 17 years old. But Zen can be dangerous to innocent minds. Such minds may easily see Zen as something good or special by which they can gain something. This attitude can lead to trouble. An innocent young person can become careless of his Buddha nature and instead attach to an idea of innocence, creating problems for himself. We need beginner's mind, not innocent mind. As long as we have beginner's mind, we have Buddhism. If we know our unchanging original nature, we can believe in the innocence of beginner's mind. At the same time, we should beware of slipping into hell through attachment to this or any idea. Soun had his own way of dealing with Shunryu and his fellow monks, thinking they were special. Every now and then he'd tell them, "You stinky boys, wash your underwear." At school, Shunryu's favorite subject was English. He excelled at it. He'd always been interested in foreign things, true to his crooked nickname. The cucumber is kuri in Japanese, the barbarian gourd. He did so well in English that a doctor named Yoshikawa in Mori asked him to tutor his sons in English. Shunryu had known the Yoshikawas since his early days at Zounin. He used to patrol the doctor's private forest and come back to report that all was okay, a pleasant task. Dr. Yoshikawa became Shunryu's sponsor, giving him spending money and friendly advice. When Shunryu got pleurisy, the doctor kept him in his home till he was well. Dr. Yoshikawa didn't want Shunryu staying with Soun at Rinso-in when Shunryu was sick, because he'd end up obediently serving Soun and neglecting himself. Shunryu would come home feverish and coughing and report that he'd been up late at night before tending Soun's smoky hibachi while his master played Go, an ancient board game played on a grid with black and white stones. One early autumn day when he was 17, Shunryu left his own inn in the morning and walked to the station in Mori to get the train to Rinsoin. After just missing it, he decided to keep walking. He walked all the way, about 40 miles, arriving that night. Shunryu's youth was full of walking. In that respect, he had more in common with his ancestors than with modern people. Walking made him the man he became, as did his parents, teachers, and karma. Yet he saw the prior generations as the strong walkers. Before his father's time, only nobles, ranking samurai, and important civil servants could ride on horses or be carried on palanquins. Everyone else walked. It was not only how they got to town and around town, it was how they got from town to town. Shunryu grew up hearing walking lore. He heard of old women who walked to Tokyo to pray for the emperor, and of monks who walked 50 miles to chant sutras on mountaintops. He liked the story of Buddha's disciple Mokuren, who was not only a scholar but a yogic walker who appeared in so many places it seemed that he must have flown through the sky. Shunryu liked to tell a walking story about his father. One Saturday, while Shunryu was at Rinsoin, one of the most dramatic and tragic events in modern Japanese history occurred. The first day of September is a traditional day of bad omens, and on Saturday, September 1st, 1923, the great Kanto earthquake devastated Tokyo and Yokohama. It was a hot, windy day. Well over half of the buildings in those cities were completely destroyed by the quake and by the blazes that followed. 100,000 people died. The quake was strong in Hiratsuka. Sogaku was in the tub when it struck, and the water sloshed back and forth. An unusual butterfly danced around him. He became convinced that it was a sign that Shunryu had died. Soon word spread to the temple of the severity of the quake. The sky was filling with smoke. The Suzuki family was distraught. That morning, Shunryu was to have left Rinsoin to return home. They calculated that he might well have been on a train in the Hakone Tunnel when the quake struck. The damaged tunnel had been closed. Fears raced through their minds. Communication and transportation were either cut off or restricted to emergency use. The family waited for Shunryu to arrive. They sent a letter and waited days for an answer. Finally, Sogaku headed out on foot. Yone wanted to go with him, but she was not in good enough condition. He crossed the mountain Hakone-san all the way to Yaizu and Rinsoin, where he found Shunryu, who was fine. He spent a day with his son, then walked the 75 miles back to tell the family the good news. May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Well, that wraps it up for Cuke Audio Podcast for today. Thank you for joining us. Come back next Tuesday and we'll get together again. And if you want to help keep Cuke Audio going, just go to cuke.com, cuke.com, and there's a donate link near the top and on the bottom of the page. It's also linked to from the Podbean page. We'd love for you to become a subscriber via PayPal. How about $1 a month? There is a minimum, though. It's $0. And if that's all you can set aside for Cuke, just mail an empty envelope or blow us a kiss. We're somewhere out there in cyberspace. Take care of yourself and don't let that nasty virus get near you or your loved ones. Till next week, I'm David Chadwick, the Poobah of Cuke Archives and Cuke Audio, with Doggett Bandita and Feline Cuchita, but without dearest, lovely Katrinka, wishing you a grand awakening.